Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Stryd for the Love of Running webinar series. As always, my name is Evan. I'm flying solo today. Might have Angus join me at the end if people send some questions along so we can do a Q&A segment as well. But we're back with another Stryd focused presentation. Today we're piggybacking off of the new Stryd guide that we are starting to produce. This week we talked about Stryd power zones in the short little video that you can find on our Instagram TV or our YouTube channel. But today we're going to give a little bit longer presentation on Stryd power zones, how you can actually track them, what you should understand about power zones, and then some examples of runs that fall in different zones so you can have a sort of more practical context for that. Starting off, if you are watching this, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, go join the Stryd community on Facebook. If you found any of the information useful in the Stryd for the Love of Running webinar series, if you found that helpful, useful at all, feel free to send it to a couple friends, tell them all the joys of running with Stryd and all the information that you are getting. Like I said, today we're going to talk about Stryd power zones, how to use power zones for effective training. So let's dive in and get started. I will also say on the top, if you're watching live here, either on our YouTube page or on our Facebook page, feel free to send any questions or comments along. We will try to fit them in if they're appropriate during the presentation, but we'll do a question and answer segment at the end. So let's dive into it. What are power zones? So first, starting off, power zones are intensity ranges based on your critical power. So as it is defined in the Stryd ecosystem, that's what we're going to talk about specifically. Power zones are intensity ranges based on your critical power. And notice how I say your critical power. How do you use power zones for training? You should use power zones to plan and execute training so you receive the intended adaptations from your work. Power zones cover a wide area, all the way from very easy recovery running all the way up to pretty much the highest intensity that you're able to put out and maintain while running. So we can classify these different areas and different zone breakdowns as guidelines. You can help plan and execute your training, also review your training. Are power zones a solution for everything? As well as it would be nice to say yes. Training can be more specific than just showing buckets of zones, and power zones are not rigid physiological cutoffs. It's more of a thing you should use as a sort of range and a guide, but it should change over time as you gain and lose fitness, as you change as an athlete over time. Power zones are not rigid physiological cutoffs. If you go from one power number to the very next watt and you happen to transition from zone 2 to zone 3, it's not a magical cutoff. It's just a good range and a good guide to keep things relative and always keep that relative intensity as your fitness changes over time. Where are my power zones? This might be a question you ask if you've never actually looked at your power zones. You can find them on stryd.com/power center. If you go to stryd.com/power center on the profile page, it'll be just to the right of your main profile where you have your profile picture, your critical power. It'll be just to the right of that. It'll say power zones. For me, my power zones range from 212 to 260 all the way up to like for my easy zone, and then 374 watts and above. Basically for my highest zone. You can also find the same exact zones on your Stryd mobile app. So I use the iOS app. You can find it on the Android app. If you click on from the home screen the critical power section, this will take you to another page that shows you your power zone. So this is good to keep as a frame of reference. We'll talk about how you can actually view these during a run as well on some of the different devices and platforms that offer zone tracking and zone training. How about when I go for a run, like I just mentioned? You can use the Stryd Zones data field and Stryd workout app on a compatible Garmin watch. So for me in particular, I like running with the Stryd Zones data field for normal easy runs, and then the Stryd workout app for workouts. You can use the Stryd app on the Apple Watch to customize your experience even more. You can use polar watches like the Vantage series or the Grit X. They have a very nice zone feature. And then on the Suunto, you can use the Suunto 9 or the Suunto Spartan. So a lot of options there. You can also run with the Stryd mobile app on your phone. It won't show you the current zone you're in, but it'll show you that power number live, so you can stay in that zone if you are prescribed sticking between a certain range. But these are the specific watches right now that add a little bit enhanced features just to show you more in-depth information about your zones. So keeping your power zones accurate by doing a variety of training includes, like I just said, including a variety of training, testing, time trials, and racing. The number one thing here to know is that if you're not putting good data in, you're not going to get good data out. That's one of the favorite quotes that I have. If I'm scrolling through the Palladino Power Project Facebook group, I'm reading stuff by Steve Palladino, who's been a guest on the show multiple times. Good in, good out. If you're not keeping accurate data coming in, relying on the power zones with inaccurate information is not going to be getting the job done. That's not the purpose there. So making sure to keep your power, your critical power, your auto-calculated critical power, or if you're doing critical power tests, making sure you're keeping that up to date and not being afraid of introducing variety into your training, not being afraid of including testing into your training, time trials into your training, and racing in your training. Those are the ways we've talked about multiple times on how to establish and maintain a auto-calculated critical power. Those are the ways to make sure that the power zones you're running with every day, the power zones you're referring to every day, the power zones you're going to be planning stuff by, that is the way to make sure that is as accurate and up to date as possible. We've done podcasts and different video series on maintaining an accurate auto-calculated critical power, so that information is readily available. Let's talk about Stryd power zones. So as it goes, we have 5 zones as sort of a basic feature in the Stryd ecosystem. Like I mentioned, you can find it at stryd.com/power center, or you can go to your Stryd mobile app. Your Stryd power zone 1 is referred to as the easy zone. This will be 65 to 80% of your critical power. And this is going to be something that we'll be giving examples of a little bit later on, in just a little bit, of specific types of runs that can help you understand in a practical way what these different zones look like. Zone number 2 is the moderate zone. This is 80 to 90% of your critical power. Zone number 3 is your threshold zone. This is 90 to 100% of your critical power. Zone number 4 is your interval zone. It's 100 to 115% of your critical power. And then zone number 5 is your repetition zone or repeat zone. This is 115% and above. We do sometimes have a range in some of the old guide materials, like 115 to 130, but for all intents and purposes, 115% and above of your critical power is what is classified as zone 5. So a couple examples of different run types. We're going to start with power zone 1. Again, this is your easy zone, and it's 65 to 80% of your critical power. Some examples of this might be an easy long run, easy time on feet long run, just focusing for spending the most time on your feet, running at a very easy effort. Might also be a base run. So if you're not really focusing necessarily on training for anything specifically right now, you're not following a training plan, you're just going out and doing a general sort of maintenance run, a base phase run. The power zone 1, the easy zone, between 65 to 80% of your critical power will probably be the range that you're in. If you're following a training plan, you'll typically have easy days or recovery days. Zone 1 can compromise both of those, or can be compromised with both of those. It can make up a pretty wide range. 65% is a pretty easy effort for most people. If your auto-calculated critical power or your overall critical power is in line with your current fitness, 65% should feel very maintainable, very easy, all the way up to 80%. That's right before you start feeling like you're working hard. So it can go all the way from that pure recovery all the way up to an easy effort run. This can also be made up of warm-ups and cool-downs for your workouts. So we'll talk a little bit more in depth about some of the different strategies that the easy zone can be broken up into from some different resources. But right now, these are all the different run types that can make up the easy zone. So here's an example. This is my data. I like doing these webinars and these presentations because it means I get to look over my data again. This is an easy long run for 1 hour at 67% of my critical power. We can see here that in the time and zones breakdown, you can find this feature in stryd.com/power center underneath the map. If you view the activity, your time and zones breakdown. So for me, I spent 99% of the run in zone 1 and 1% of the run in zone 2. So I did a pretty good job at sticking right at that very easy effort. I like to try and run as low of a range as possible in my easy zone and recovery days, just because I know that helps me feel ready, refreshed to go for the hard workout days. So an example is an easy longer run of 1 hour at 67% of my critical power. Again, this should mean that the large majority of my run is in zone 1, and it happens to be that 99% of the run was in zone 1. Power zone 2, this is the moderate zone. It's between 80 to 90% of your critical power. You can think of things like moderate long runs, introducing some more marathon power workouts, an up tempo before hill repeats. I talked about some different workout examples a couple webinar episodes ago. One was a 20-minute warm up, a 5K up tempo, so in that moderate zone, and then doing some hill repeats. So I like to kind of keep that in my training because I don't want to go into hill repeats just after running an easy warm up. I want to get my body a little bit ready to go. But the moderate zone, that 80 to 90% of my critical power, that's something that I find really successful to help me feel ready to go for the hill repeats. So an example here is a long run I did pretty recently. It was a 4-mile warm up at 70% of my critical power, 10 miles at a moderate 87% of my critical power. So again, if you remember, 80 to 90% of your critical power is the moderate zone. So 10 miles right smack dab in the middle there. Then a 3-mile cool down at 65% of critical power. You can definitely see the zone distribution there. There were a couple times when I was going up some rolling hills that I pushed a little bit too hard, but over half the run, 58% of the run was in zone 2. So I got the job done. If we zoomed in a little bit more on that 10-mile section in the middle, we would have seen that almost 100% of that section was in zone 2. I stuck really, really well within that 80 to 90% of critical power. Power zone 3. This is your threshold zone, and this is where we start getting into more specific workouts. So it's actually kind of funny. We'll talk more about zone 2, 3, 4, 5, but for the most part, the large majority of your time spent running is in zone 1 all the way up to maybe a little bit lower end of zone 2. If you typically run your easy days a little bit faster. Like I mentioned myself personally, I like to run my easy days very, very easy. We'll talk a lot about zone 3, 4, and 5 because that's where a lot of the quality comes from, but you'll spend a lot of time running in zone 1 and zone 2. So power zone 3, the threshold zone, like I mentioned, 90 to 100% of your critical power. You can think of things like tempo runs that are continuous, cruise intervals, which are essentially the same thing as tempo runs with a little bit of recovery, breaking up that continuous tempo. Or your 10K power. This will be pretty close to getting up to 10K power training for most people, between that 90 to 100% of critical power. For some people, it's all the way from marathon power at that 90% all the way up to a little bit under their 10K power. But for most people, tempo runs, cruise intervals, 10K power training. So an example here is a threshold run. I was doing some mile repeats, and I was aiming to be within zone 3. So right at threshold, we can see that out of this mile repeat, 75% of the repeat was at zone 3, 23% was in zone 4. So just a tiny bit going a little bit aggressive. You can see the little bit of a line right above that critical power. But for the most part, I did a pretty good job here. But threshold is the stuff that you should think of. This was a cruise interval workout, but it's always refreshing to make sure that I'm not dipping too much into zone 4 when the goal is to run pretty within yourself at a threshold effort. Power zone 4 is the next one. These are the interval zones. 100% to 115% of your critical power will be the range here. These will comprise of shorter to medium intervals, short fartlek runs, closer to your 5K power typically. So above what you could sustain for critical power, you should be able to run your 5K at a little bit higher than critical power. So this will start to get closer to 5K versus 10K. An example here is a little bit quicker mile repeat. We can see for this one, 97% of the time was in zone 4. So this is above threshold. This is in that interval zone. I took a little bit longer recovery. This was I think it was a 3 by mile, 3 by 800 workout with a couple of quicker 200s at the end. But for me, this was a great workout. I was exactly right in zone 4. This was supposed to be faster than threshold. And I thought I did a great job of maintaining that. Power zone 5, this is the repetition zone. So 115% and above of your critical power. You can think of things like track work, hill repeats, short intervals, things that you're maintaining a high intensity for a relatively short amount of time with a moderate amount of rest in between. An example here would be hill repeats. We can see that I had 5 hill repeats here in this selected section with a easy jog recovery back down. So even though the majority of the time was spent in zone 1, I had a little bit more than a quarter, so 26% of the time overall here in zone 5, because we can see how intense these hill repeats were. This was actually super cool to see, and I want to give a really cool use case. I've been building up hill repeats over the past couple of weeks, and this was the first time that I ran on a paved hill. So instead of like a dirt road hill, so I was able to run a little bit harder, a little bit faster up the hill, able to output a little bit more power. But after this workout, I was so excited because I came back to stryd.com/power center. I looked at my power duration curve. I compared my last 30 days versus my all-time data. And it turns out that in the middle two, or the third and fourth repeat here, I actually set my personal best power ever using Stryd from 5 to 30 seconds. And so that was a use case I was extremely proud of, but I've been able to make sure that I'm building up to this specific amount, able to achieve a personal best in training with Stryd, because I've been able to say, okay, I know my hill repeats should be in zone 5. I know the power number that I'm targeting. I know what that feels like now after practicing for that for weeks and months. So I was really excited for that. But we can see here that power zone 5, for this use case, it's specifically doing hard hill repeats up a pretty steep incline, running pretty quick there. So let's talk about power zones in the context of a training week. So I gave you examples of power zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, what a specific run might look like. But let's look at an actual training week that I've done and see how zones are incorporated differently throughout the week. So Monday, this was power zone 1 for 50 minutes. 100% of this run was done in zone 1. This was 215 watts. I believe my easy zone starts at 214 watts. So like I said, I really like to make sure that I'm getting recovery and feeling really recovered in easy efforts during my easy runs. So a 50-minute run, right about a 10K run, a little bit of elevation gain in there, but 100% of that was in zone 1, because come Tuesday, I had a fartlek, and this was focusing specifically on a little bit faster than threshold. So this was just the tiniest little bit quicker. These are 3-minute repeats, running some rolling terrain. We can see a little bit of uphill, a little bit of up and down, and then a little bit of down to finish. The pace was kind of, up and down, varied on the terrain, but my power, I kept that in a really good range. The large majority of the workout was in zone 4, and that was the exact goal. So I incorporated zone 1 on Monday, and then for this workout specifically, zone 4 was the target. Tuesday, I also did hills after that, those 3-minute repeats. And this is, again, focusing on zone 5. So while I might have the large majority of this specific selection in zone 1 due to the jog back down recovery, the zone 5 for the hills was the target. And I had almost 30% of the overall selection here in zone 5, because I know exactly, again, how hard to run the hills, based on my specific range. My goal for hills is to look at where zone 5 starts, know that I should be above 374 watts, and I know what that effort feels like now after training to that intensity over the past couple weeks and months. Wednesday, again, this is a 100% easy zone. I actually managed to squeeze down 1 watt all the way to 214 watts. Again, a little bit of elevation gain here, but keeping the easy so I can make sure that the intensity comes later in the week. Thursday, power zone 1 for the majority plus a couple strides. So I actually was able to incorporate a little bit of intensity into this relatively easy run. We can see almost 90% of the overall run was in zone 1, but I put in some moderate strides to prepare for a workout the next day. The strides were pretty progressive, so I started a little bit under critical power and then slowly worked my way up and slowly worked in a little bit of intensity there. Friday, this was, again, power zone 4 for mile repeats, so a little bit above threshold. I made sure that I had a specific number in mind. So my threshold, my critical power right now, I believe, is 329. So the goal was to be above 329, if not get a little bit closer to 340, 335, something like that. You can see that I executed that perfectly because I referenced my zone. I knew exactly the intensity, the relative intensity, and that power number that I had to hit. So this is another example of being able to incorporate a different zone in training. On Saturday, again, like I mentioned, big fan of the easy run. So 94% of this 60-minute run was in zone 1, just a little bit in zone 2. I was feeling pretty good. Ran a little bit moderate effort for a little bit of the run, but no more than 6 or 7% of the run was in zone 2. Prepping for Sunday. So Sunday was a little bit of a mix. This was a pretty hilly long run, starting up at about 8,400 feet above sea level, so getting closer to 2,500, 2,600 meters above sea level. So up in the mountains, it's a pretty decent uphill and then a pretty decent downhill. The first couple sections have some rolling hills, and I like to not be afraid of them necessarily, but I wanted to make sure that this long run didn't leave me toasted for the workouts to come later in the week, the next week, as I was wrapping up this week. I had 51% of this run in zone 1, 41% in zone 2, 7% in zone 3, 1% in zone 4. So I like to, somewhat keep a mix of intensity on my long runs. The week before this was actually the example where I said I ran a 4-mile warm-up. I did a 10-mile moderate section, and then I did a 3-mile cool down. So I wanted to make sure I didn't have the majority of this run in zone 2, but I didn't want to shy away necessarily from touching on that zone 2 moderate effort. So we had a pretty good balance, a little bit more than half of the run in zone 1, but then a little bit under half in zone 2 specifically. So that's a example of just being able to reference some of the specific power zones. And if my training was in a different time of the year, I might have a larger focus on more zone 5 work on the track. I might have a larger focus if I'm prepping for a marathon for that zone 2 to zone 3 work, for those longer sustained efforts. But right now I'm focusing a little bit on the shorter effort, a little bit on the 5K side. So zone 4 is going to be my bread and butter for some of those track workouts, but I want to be able to support that by accumulating mileage and efforts over time. So zone 1 and zone 2 are really going to be that bread and butter for the long runs, and zone 1 is going to be the bread and butter always for those easy runs for me. So all 5 power zones covered in 1 week. I managed to touch on everything, incorporated a little bit of everything, and I definitely would encourage, if people are curious, just review your last week of training, look at each activity one by one, and just say, did I do a good job at sticking in power zone 1 for my easy day? I had a goal threshold workout. Did I actually stick in zone 3? Was I actually sticking to the goal, or was I running a little bit too aggressive or a little bit too easy for my threshold? I had strides or hill repeats or short track stuff. Was I actually touching on zone 5, or was I not actually running as hard as I need to? Was I not running as hard as I need to because I wasn't adding enough rest? Take a look at that and just kind of look a little bit more into your training. That would be a suggestion that I would have. It's very fun to dive in and just see that sort of distribution over the course of your past training. We can just see how in a practical way, how do your power zones become incorporated during your running. Are there other training zones? Yes, there are. The Stryd power zone method isn't the only way that you can train by. It's not the only thing that you can possibly incorporate into your type of training, but we like to start off just talking about the Stryd power zone. So now we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other training zones that are out there. Starting off, this comes from the Paladino Power Project, the running power zones. I would highly recommend, if people haven't already and you're interested in zones in general, just finish watching this presentation. We'll link the resources as well. But this information comes from Steve Paladino of the Paladino Power Project. And this talks a little bit more about breaking up some of the zones into different subzones. So I'll talk through this relatively quickly, but there are some slight differences in the Paladino zones, and some of the other zones we'll cover as well. So the first major difference is zone 1 being broken up into 3 different purposes. Like I mentioned, 65 to 80% of your critical power is the Stryd zone 1, or the easy zone. Starting off for the Paladino zone 1, it's zone 1A, which is a post-interval recovery. This is going to be a easy recovery between intervals. So notice the specific wording here, between intervals, so that higher intensity, and your cool down. Zone 1B is an easy warm-up component before intervals or racing. So this is a little bit faster, a little bit higher intensity than your recovery in between your intervals, but it's not necessarily too fast. Zone 1C is easy aerobic running, and this is going to be 75 to 80% of your critical power. This is going to be something that you do as sort of a general run throughout the training block. Zone 2 is 80 to 88% of your critical power. So tiny bit of difference. Typically, Steve writes that this is the average power for long runs or over distance, which are sustained runs with higher intensity mixed in. Otherwise, it's a gray zone for more standard lengthening of aerobic runs. Again, that's 80 to 88% of your critical power. As we get closer to 100% of your critical power, we have 2 different types of threshold stimulus in the Paladino zones. The extensive threshold versus the intensive threshold. There are 2 distinct differences here. So zone 3A is the extensive threshold. That's between 88 to less than 95% of your critical power. Steve referenced this as sweet spot running, tempo runs, generally sustained effort runs executed at the lower percentages of your critical power, or longer. This is longer than 15 minutes or equal to 15 minutes, longer intervals at the higher percentages of your critical power within this zone. Above extensive threshold, we have intensive threshold. And this is 95 to 101% of your critical power. Typically, this will be longer intervals and occasionally sustained effort running, but still this is broken up into sort of intervals. You can absolutely work between the threshold stimulus, have extensive and intensive. There are differences, not just looking and saying 90 to 100% of critical power is all the same thing. There's absolutely room to add different efforts in there. Like we mentioned, tempo runs or marathon pace. For some people, 10K pace. There's a lot of different abilities in there that you can absolutely incorporate. After that, there's zone 4, 5, 6, and 7. So zone 4 is supra threshold, which is generally a little bit shorter intervals above critical power, 101% to 106%. So this is getting pretty specific now. This is, like I mentioned, 101 to 106, so it's harder than your critical power. Generally, it's broken up into intervals. It's going to be more intense than that sustained threshold, that extensive and intensive threshold. Zone 5 is maximum aerobic power. This is maximum aerobic work. Typically, it is intervals. It's 106 to 116% of your critical power. After that, you have your anaerobic power stimulus. This is anaerobic work, short intervals, adding plenty of recovery, short time trials, and this is 116 to 150% of your critical power. And above that, you have zone 7, your sprint or maximal power work. We are absolutely fans of incorporating strides or harder sprints or hills into the Stryd training plans and the Stryd ecosystem. So it's important to reference maximal power and sprinting, and this is above 150% of your critical power. So this is just another example of a different zone system out there. I'd absolutely encourage people to, if this is intriguing you, this is piquing your curiosity, absolutely go to the Paladino Power Project Facebook group and read a little bit more about some of the work that is done there. The zones are great to read into. Steve writes more and more about this, more than I can talk about it, at least on the webinar. Heart rate versus power zones. This is another sort of thing. A lot of people say, well, you know, I maybe am used to training in heart rate zones. I know the concept of a zone, but I don't want to switch to power zones because I don't know how to switch things. Well, we've done the work for you. If you're using a pretty standard heart rate zone, 50 to 60% for your easy zone, 60 to 70% for zone 2, that moderate zone, 70 to 80% of max heart rate for zone 3, 80 to 90% for zone 4, 90 to 100% of max heart rate for zone 5. Those translate very, very easily to the Stryd power zones. And we have this incorporated in stryd.com/guide. Right now, you can read more about this. And then we have a couple more tables here. I'm not going to go too much in depth, but this is just showing you the Stryd power zones and how they can be incorporated versus Training Peaks heart rate zones. If you use the Training Peaks heart rate zone for your lactate threshold heart rate zone, that's a very, very easy translation to Stryd power zones. And if you incorporate Jim Vance's power zones, this is a way to translate it to Stryd power zones as well. So absolutely worth reading more at stryd.com/guide. Or if you have used any of these other power zones, this is just an easy way to show you that there is translation there. It's not necessarily an excuse to say, oh, I don't want to take the time to translate it myself. We have done the work for you. So don't be afraid. Don't be too shy to start maybe looking more at your Stryd power zones, not necessarily having to dictate all your training by it, but analyze it, understand it a little bit more. So some common questions. And like I said, if you do have any questions, we will be answering them in a couple slides from now. So feel free to send those along either on the YouTube webinar link or in the Facebook channel right now if you are watching live. First question is, my zone 1 is way too easy. I hear this all the time from some runners who are newer with Stryd or some people who are returning from an injury. If your zone 1, you feel like you literally have to walk or you have to run way too easy of an effort, the first thing that we would typically say is make sure your critical power is in line with your current fitness. If you are coming back from an injury, you might have that base fitness to maintain some of those easy efforts. So it might be okay to do a moderate effort time trial, do a moderate effort sort of 5K, 10K, just to get the zone calibrated correctly. But if your zone 1 is too easy, your auto-calculated critical power is probably underestimated, is the answer that we have for that one. How do I update my critical power if I only train in my zones? This is going to piggyback off of what I was just saying. We've had a lot of webinar and a lot of video content, social media content, talking about making sure your auto-calculated critical power is established correctly and it's updated correctly. So don't shy away from doing some time trials, some race efforts in that 15 to 20 minute range to make sure that your critical power stays updated. If you're only training in zones and you're not seeing any progress over the course of 6 or 8 weeks, go ahead and test again. Add a little bit of variety in the training. Make sure that you are testing yourself, because testing is training, and that is absolutely a true statement. What % of critical power should I target for track work? This is a great question. You could go and run an easy run on a track. Would you consider that track work? It could totally be if you're working on making sure your form is sound, making sure you are correcting any potential imbalances. If you like just running on a very easy maintenance surface like a track, that's absolutely fine. If you're doing more intensive repeats, again, we talked about the differences between zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for the Stryd power zones. If you're running zone 3, that's going to be that threshold effort. You can still absolutely do threshold effort on the track. That's actually a great way to start to intro yourself to just that intensity before going out and incorporating that. If you're running a longer road race, doing some introduction stuff on the track is absolutely great. When it comes down to actual percent, this is something that is totally reliant on your training program. If you are targeting specific goal times that you found with the Stryd race calculator, then having that sort of goal time range or goal power range that you can use with the race calculator, that should give you the sort of breakdown in those little smaller ranges that should fit within certain zones. If you're running a 10K on the track, you're doing 10K pace work, 10K power work, then you would obviously be closer to that zone 3, zone 4, 5K, like I mentioned, zone 4, anything a little bit faster or shorter than 5K, typically zone 4 to zone 5. That's something for you to actually explore as well. So take a look if you have been doing track work or shorter work, what zone are you actually falling in? Are you actually not running as hard as you should be? Are you running a little bit too hard? Just take a little bit of understanding and take a little bit of a peek into your own training and just see how that distribution is going. So now it's time for your questions. I believe we've had some come in via the chat. I believe Angus is going to drop in right on cue. Hello, Angus. How are you doing today?
Hi, Evan.
Good. Let's see. Do you want to ask questions, or would you like me to ask the questions?
I'll serve them up to you. We've
Sure.
had a lot of great questions today, and a lot of these were answered in chat, but it'll be great to have them on stream for anyone listening to the podcast.
Yep.
So Bjorn asks, is the repetition run the same as an interval zone, for example?
Yeah, I think there are differences. If I'm looking at a repetition, a repeat or a repetition zone is a little bit higher intensity than an interval. And it comes down to naming principles, but as far as it goes in the Stryd ecosystem, zone 5, the repetition, it is going to be the zone above. So again, it's that 115% and above. Zone 4 is going to be a little bit underneath that.
We have a question from Chris. What zone or percentage of critical power would encompass an ultramarathon race, like a 50K race or 50-mile race?
Yeah, I think that it depends on your ability. So if your goal is to go out and complete a 50K or a 50-miler, then definitely not touching that zone 2 would definitely be the goal, to be under zone 2, to be all in the easy zone. For some people, as it seems, ultra running is getting more and more popular. So there are people that can go out and run, 6-minute mile pace, 340, 345 Ks for 50K or 50 milers. Like, that is a thing. So they are running, in that high end of that moderate zone, like under that threshold, for sure. But for 50K, I have a friend that just ran the third fastest 50K ever on a track. He ran, I think it was like 125 laps of an indoor track, and you have to come through the marathon in like 2:17. So that's like right under the threshold. So for the very, very top people, it's dependent on the ability. But for most people, if your goal is to run to completion, then zone 1 would absolutely be the target, not being afraid to incorporate run walk to overcome the distance of 50K or 50 miles. But typically zone 1, maybe into the very, very low end of zone 2, is going to be ultra marathon races.
We have another question from Bjorn, and Bjorn asks, when running intervals with power zones, should I set the app to pause when I rest?
I don't pause my watch when I take recoveries. I think this is a personal question. I let it run because I think that's the best representation Correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we incorporate both use cases. So even if you pause or even if you let it running, that doesn't affect the Stryd data.
Evan is correct. Both use cases are considered, so you can choose to pause your watch or not pause your watch, and that'll have the same impact on your Stryd profile. I would recommend using the lap button for when you do rest, because that'll help better segment out your work when you do your run after the fact.
Yep.
Here is a question from Tyler that I think you may have touched on a bit at the end, but it'll be good to recap. Does Power Zone 5 encompass 3K pace and faster generally?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Again, totally depends on the person and the ability, but I would absolutely say, yeah, the middle to high end of Zone 4 to Zone 5 would be thought of as that 3K. If you're referring to maybe velocity at VO2, I know that's something that it's a metric that some coaches look at, some training programs say. So that's closer to that 3K. That maximum aerobic power, like around 5K, 3K faster, generally middle to high end of Zone 4 into Zone 5, I would say.
Here is a question from me, actually, and I want to ask, what happens if it gets really hot out? For example, let's say I had a very cool last few months, and then all of a sudden the weather turns very hot. What should I be thinking about in terms of my critical power and power zones for adjusting my training when it gets really hot out?
Yeah. So the important thing to remember is your auto-calculated critical power looks over the last 90 days of your data. And so if for the last 3 months you've been running in very nice low humidity, low temperature, the data will reflect that. You have to be mindful that if you increase the humidity, the temperature, the elevation that you're at, that the numbers will change because it's relative based on the conditions that you were performing in. There are some great resources to calculate, okay, if I have been training in this weather generally and now I'm running in this weather generally, how much percentage should I change things by? So there's a great resource. I don't know if we can probably link that in the description. But just the calculators out there are a great way to get an easy approximation. But if you're going from cooler weather to warmer weather, you should decrease your intensity. Just be mindful of the fact that it will be more difficult for you to maintain the same effort.
I will grab that link and put it inside of the comments.
Cool.
While I'll do that, I have another question from Matt. So Matt is asking, what is the best way to use power zones on the Apple Watch? I know that you're a big Apple Watch user, Evan. How do you set up power zones on the Apple Watch?
Yeah, so I believe with the latest update is what I'm thinking back to. If you go to the Apple Watch home screen, gives you the nice big orange run button, gives you the workout. If you scroll down, you can adjust all your settings there. So I believe Matt in this question said, I just see power or power CP, not zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. So if you scroll down, you'll actually have TP or TZ. So that stands for target power or target zone. That's a toggle. And if you toggle it to TZ, target zone, you can select there zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. And then this is a screen that actually pops up. If you have a standard layout, let's just say you are using all 3 screens on the Apple Watch, you scroll past all 3 screens, and then underneath that, it'll actually show your target. And you can set your target versus what you're actually in as well. So it'll notify you, but you can use that for target power and target zone.
I dropped the link to the super power calculator inside the comment section. And if you don't see that, you can easily access this by going to our Stryd community on Facebook. Click on the file section. And in the file section, you will find a super power calculator link. And inside of that calculator, you'll find a way to adjust the power target for temperature, humidity, and elevation.
Yep.
We have a question from Yuri here. So why do you use the 6-3 lap manual critical power test instead of the 3-6 laps? So he's basically talking about the short versus long part and the order of those parts. So why would you run the long interval before the short interval, or why would you run the short interval before the long interval?
Yeah, so when it comes to this specific test, it's important to remember all considerations of the test and going through the procedure and looking at each individual step. So before the test, we have a warm-up to make sure you're warmed up and you're prepared to run well. If you just run an easy 10-minute warm-up and then you go immediately into the 3-lap or the 3 minutes test, the shorter portion first, you might not be warmed up to actually perform at a max effort. Then you take your recovery, which in between we recommend 30 minutes recovery, full recovery, and that's walk, jog, make sure you are fully recovered, your body's fully replenished, you take hydration, whatever you need to do to make sure you're fully recovered, and then do the longer effort. In a practical case, if you do a substandard warm-up and you're not actually warmed up, you're underperforming on the 3-lap or the shorter portion, and then you're ready, recovered, you're warmed up for the 6-lap portion, and you're actually performing right in line, but you underperformed on the 3-lap. And so that will give you not as accurate of a critical power number from this manual test. If you do a good quality warm-up and you run the 6-lap at a all-out effort, then you take your 30 minutes and then you come back and you have the target of outperforming your 6-lap target, that sets you up better to make sure you're performing in line with your fitness. So if it does come down to it, athlete A and athlete B could run the exact same performances with the methods flip-flopped, and they would get the same number. But just for the sake of consistency in testing and repeatability, I do like to recommend the longer effort first, the shorter effort second, to make sure that you're able to perform at your best possible effort over the 2 test protocols. I don't know if you have anything to add to that one, Gus.
No, I think that's a good representation, and we'll move on to the next question for now. So we have a question from Kev, and he has a 2-part question. He says, if I want to work on my fatigue resistance, what power range should I target? For example, should I target 88+%? And the second thing that Kev asks is, will this impact my critical power if I beat my previous duration at that target intensity?
Yeah, both great questions. For number one, if I want to work on my fatigue resistance, what power range should I target? It's important to understand what the terminology is here for fatigue resistance. So if you go to stryd.com/power center, you scroll down, look at the right-hand side of the power duration curve, and you look at the training distribution, and you look at fatigue resistance. That would be, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Gus, but that's based on the event that you say you are training for right now. So if you're 5K, 10K, half, full, ultra marathon, that will change based on the specific event that you say you're training for. So for some people, if you're running an ultra marathon, you'll have a little bit lower fatigue resistance goal as a percentage of your critical power. If you're training for 5K, 10K, it'll get a little bit higher than that as well. So it's important to know what event you're training for to guide what the number you're looking at for fatigue resistance. If you want to work on fatigue resistance, typically it comes along with better race performances, your body's ability to sustain a higher power for a longer duration. Again, the power duration concept. And number two, will this affect CP if I beat my previous duration at that zone? It's not guaranteed. The best way to understand of kind of gamifying the power duration curve, if you will, is to turn on the modeled critical power and take a look at where a specific sort of duration goes out to and the specific power that you were able to sustain for that amount of time. So it's not guaranteed that it'll beat your previous duration at that intensity. But if you would like to see what number you have to hit specifically, taking a look at the modeled curve there would be the thing to do. I hope that answered the question. If not, feel free to ask another one. Another question here. I found for myself that 40 minutes plus at 100% of CP helps with my fatigue resistance. Is this correct from a power duration curve as well as physiological point of view? Again, tying in with the power duration model, if you are running at a specific intensity, then you will have the ability to sustain that power for a longer duration, or you will have to sustain a higher power for a shorter duration, or a longer duration, a little bit lower power. It's, again, power duration model. If you are working specifically on the fatigue resistance for, say, 10K or 5K, running at 100% of critical power will improve that metric. If you're training for marathon, extending, I think we say it's 88% of critical power right now is the specific fatigue resistance for that. That would be the primary driver there for that metric. So the fatigue resistance is an interesting thing. It's not the thing that you should necessarily focus all of your training on, but it is something that is sort of reflective of showing your training distribution. And that was the goal of the training distribution side. That's all the questions I see for now. Gus might send a couple more through. I did want to plug one more time. We have a new guide. So we're working on incorporating more updated information, including stuff like air power into the guide, all this stuff from the new Stryd that released about a year ago. The new guide, our goal is to have it be more community driven. So we want you to let us know what you want to hear from, what you have questions about. We want to make it shareable. So give the ability to share out that information in easy, quick doses, and then follow it up with longer webinar series like this. So for example, earlier this week on Monday, we released a video talking about Stryd power zones. And then would you look at that, on Friday, we're talking about Stryd power zones in a longer format. We want to keep all that information kind of contained there. So this is a great work in progress. We're really excited to keep adding more and more to it. But for now, you can go to stryd.com/guide. We have links also, like I mentioned, in the Facebook community, or if you go to our YouTube or social media, it'll be there. Last question I see here from Curtis is, I've been in pandemic-induced easy running mode since all my races have been canceled. So my auto CP has gone way down. If I do a CP test now, does it just use that for my CP? This is also covered in our new guide. You can enter a manual critical power test. We give you those instructions. But if you do run a CP test, both of those data points will be considered. So that is one of the great things about auto-calculated critical power as well, is it incorporates all your efforts over time, over the last 90 days. And if you do run a CP test, it'll consider that as well. In general, we have found that the auto CP is more accurate and reliable for more people, but it is absolutely fine to, if you have started getting back into training with pandemic-induced easy running, then doing a CP test is a great way to kickstart those efforts as well. Any other questions we've had come through, Gus?
That covers everything.
Cool. I think that is it from my side as well. Any messages you want to plug before we get going?
Let's jump to the next slide, just so we can show people the link for that new guide.
Sure. Check out the new Stryd guide, summit.stryd.com/guide. You can go there, summit.stryd.com/guide for the new guide. We're really excited to make this more interactive, really excited to make this user-driven, more modern sort of approach. Again, like I mentioned, shareable. If you watch a video, if you go subscribe to our YouTube channel, these videos will also pop up there. So you'll actually get a first peek. If you do subscribe to the YouTube channel, turn on notifications there. Every time we release a new video, you'll be notified immediately when a new portion is added to the guide there. So very, very excited about that. And I believe Stryd is in stock and shipping right now. Is that correct, Gus?
Yeah, if you want to start running with Stryd, start collecting enough data to use the new race power calculator, which can inform a target for a time trial, and get ready for some new exciting features we have coming up for the rest of the year. Now is the perfect time to order your Stryd. You can do that at store.stryd.com, and Stryd is in stock and it is shipping. So this is a great way to liven up your running during the pandemic times.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. This was another episode of the Stryd for the Love of Running webinar series. We will be back next week with another episode. Stay healthy, and we'll see everybody later. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stryders.